Yeah.
You're all set to begin.
Okay, great, thank you. All right. All right, we'll start then. Okay. I'd like to welcome everyone to the February 11th meeting of the Committee to Review and Assess Zoning and Review the town's use of regulatory agreements. Start by reading the Mass General Law statement. This meeting is being recorded and will be rebroadcast on the Town of Barnstable's Government Access Channel. In accordance with Mass General Laws, Chapter 30A, Section 20, the chair must inquire whether anyone else is recording this meeting, and if so, to please make their presence known. Seeing none. This meeting will be replayed via Xfinity Channel 8 or High Definition Channel 1072. It may also be accessed via the Government Access Channel live video on demand archives on the Town of Barnstable's website as well. Go ahead and turn it over to Cynthia for a roll call.
Members of the committee, Catherine Ledeck.
Here.
Ken Alsman.
Here.
Councilor Jeffrey Mendez. Councilor John Crow.
Here.
Councilor Matthew Lebec. Councilor Kristen Turkelson.
Here.
Councilor Charlie Broom. Seth Etienne.
Here.
And Chair of Committee, Bob Schulte.
Here.
You have quorum.
Thank you, and I'll just mention, Councilor Bloom indicated he was under the weather, would not be in attendance. And I think also that Attorney Connolly was going to be participating remotely via Zoom today.
That's correct.
Okay. Read the purpose of the committee, which is to work with the town's planning and development staff to review and reassess recently adopted zoning changes, review the town's use of regulatory agreements, and make recommendations to the council. Just again, like to thank the committee and members of the public for joining us today. We continue to appreciate the public's interest in our committee's work. We've received numerous emails and have had quite a few members of the public address us at our meetings. Just a reminder that comments can be provided either in person, via Zoom, or in writing. Email comments should be sent to the attention of Cynthia Lovell at cynthia.lovell@town.barnstable.ma.us. Please note ad hoc zoning committee in the subject line, and Cynthia will forward all emails to the committee members. Housekeeping, I don't have anything left from last meeting or for today, unless anyone else has any thoughts or comments. All right, I think then we will go to public comment. I'd like to remind the public that actually today the Zoom link will be left open since Attorney Connolly is participating, so this will be left open as well. But we'll go to public commenters in the room if they'd like to speak.
Where would you like us?
Why don't you can sit right here.
All right.
Just
Right on up.
yeah.
Thank you.
Share with us your name and village.
Absolutely. Good evening, everyone. My name is Ella Sampu. I'm a Precinct 11 voter. West Barnstable, Chris Clark is my representative. I have a background in housing and community engagement around affordable housing. I spend a majority of my time watching meetings like this in other towns around the Cape, and am regularly reading zoning. So wanted to chime in here today as you consider making amends to the form-based code that was recently passed, and recognize the amount of work that went into creating that code in the first place. The Cape Cod Commission took that zoning reform on tour across the Lower and Outer Cape, holding it up as a shining example of successful zoning reform. So wanted to begin by noting that. Additionally, on your agenda, I know there's a discussion of parking minimums and a discussion of maybe moving that minimum up to 2 spots per unit. I really want to caution you all against that decision. Primarily because parking spaces drive up the cost of housing. I can't give you a number specifically for how that would look in the town of Barnstable, but I'm certain that those numbers would be easy to find working with statewide housing groups. Designing for parking encourages reliance on cars. We have a lot of congestion in Hyannis already. We also do have a functioning bus line. We have trains that take people in and out in the summer. We have a ferry. This part of Hyannis is already well designed to be a transportation hub. In certain corners of Hyannis, it's already a fairly walkable area. If we build for cars, we create reliance on cars. If we do not build for reliance on cars, people find other ways to get around. Especially, I myself am in the process of buying a new car right now. They're expensive. A lot of families in our communities don't have more than one car. It's not necessary. Many people, especially in Hyannis, don't have cars at all. The Cape Cod Commission in May of 2024 advocated for adopting parking maximums rather than minimums. Again, because it drives down costs and it provides for better or more creative land use. And I wanted to name Provincetown as a beautiful example of a dense seaside historic area that does not have parking minimums. So I go up there regularly. I always find parking. The residents there don't have an issue. I also wanted to speak to the discussion of height limitations. I'm under the impression that there's discussion of maybe lowering those minimums. I think we'd be remiss to sacrifice a potential fourth floor of housing given the severe need in our immediate community and across the Cape. But also given, we have these pre-existing non-conforming structures around Hyannis that are at least 3.5 stories tall. Driving here this evening, I don't notice them, they don't stand out. Certainly height is not blocking a view. Blocking a view of what another parking lot, I don't know. I don't think we sacrifice anything in aesthetics by going up one more floor. And to mention Provincetown again, a place where they build a little taller. The library in Provincetown has at least 3 floors, and it did give me a view of the harbor, and I was quite excited to be so high up. I think that extra stories around here could maybe give us a view that wouldn't exist otherwise. Zoning in general. Something that really stuck with me from this past week of work was that if we don't zone for 3.5 or 4 stories and we lose one of our 3.5-story buildings, we can't rebuild it. It's better to have that flexibility. It's zoning's not a mandate. We don't have to do it just because we can. It's better to have the option to do it and not use it than not have the option at all. So thank you for hearing me out, and thank you for the hard work you are all doing.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
My name is, Satchel Douglas, like the handbag.
You say that a lot, don't you?
I do. I have a whole number of different jokes to get people to hear it. I live in Hyannis by the Rotary, which I think I'm in Charlie's district.
Which road?
Which road?
Which rotary?
Oh, the one by the airport.
Okay.
I moved here fairly recently in the last year because Hyannis is one of the few places on the Cape where you can not be completely car dependent. And that was important to me. I bike a lot to get around. I will caveat that by saying we're not fully there, right? Biking is pretty accessible. I can do everything I need to in my life on the bike. For people who don't want to bike, walking maybe we don't have the density to support that level, that same accessibility in a walking standpoint. So to speak about parking restriction or parking minimums, I believe, strongly believe that parking minimums reduce density, and the reduction in density makes it harder to have that kind of walkability lifestyle that I think a lot of people are looking for and possibly even moving here for. I did come up with some numbers. Ella and I just met. We did not plan this, but I'm an engineer. So the discussion you all were having maybe last week, I think the recommended parking spot size is 9 by 18, which is 162 square feet. A median price of about $500 per square feet. That's an additional between $81,000 and $140,000, and the cost per unit, per parking space added to a building. If you add, 1.5 spaces to a unit, that drives up the cost of the unit on a monthly basis by approximately $700
Per year.
per month.
Per month.
$700 roughly. Yes. It also reduces the town's tax. I'm not a tax expert, but I believe it reduces the town's tax revenue, right? Because you don't have interior square footage. So about $800 per parking space per year. So for a 50-unit building, that's $40,000 of revenue you're giving up in addition to the added cost that the renter is paying. And then I also, I haven't been to all of these meetings. I spent as much time watching the reviews as I could, but I don't think I'm, fully up to speed on what you all have discussed. However, I would just like to point out that the comments and, people complaining about parking may not represent a statistical, sample of who's actually affected, right?
Sure.
Not everybody can come here to give comment or know their counselor's number to call. And so increasing the minimum based on a handful of complaints is maybe not fully doing justice to the whole community. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Excuse me, could you go over your numbers again on the cost of parking?
I could, yes. 9 by 18 square foot parking spot is 162 square feet.
Yeah.
Roughly, I'm assuming a real estate price of roughly $500 per square foot. That's the median for like Redfin for the region. New construction, I don't know whether new construction makes that more or less expensive, but we're starting from somewhere. So that's roughly $81,000 for one spot. And then I just took the, amortization of that increase in property value over 30 years to calculate the monthly, loan payment, which is passed on to the renter if you're a
Right.
commercial landlord.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Do we have anyone on Zoom?
Mr. Moore?
Hi, Bob. I don't have anything today. I'm gonna listen.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Moore. All right,
Is Attorney Conley on?
okay.
Yeah, I don't know where she is. She was sent the link, but
But is it a different link now?
I'm sorry?
Is it a different
No.
link? No, okay.
That's why it took them a little longer
Okay.
to start the meeting, because they had to switch everything audio to whatever Zoom link was.
Okay. I guess we'll go to written correspondence from the public. I think we had the one item that was sent to us that Cynthia included in the package from, and was emailed to, from Chris Kuhn regarding some of his comments and concerns. He's spoken to the previous committee previously. He's also sent other comments to us via email. I'll let you read through that, but essentially Mr. Kuhn expressed several comments, concerns, regulations for short-term rental on the properties that are being built, and I was gonna turn to Jim. I know some of the projects have some limitations on that, but some of the concerns he expressed were that if we end up with a glut or overbuilt market rate housing and end up having landlords that have excess vacancies, if there's no restrictions on the short-term rental of these properties, are we gonna have a situation where we have short-term rental and issues that come with that? They also concerned, too many apartments built, landlords may decide they need to short-term rent apartments to prevent them from being left vacant. Also expressed concerns about impacts of short-term rentals on parking and whether units being short-term rented would count as affordable. So I'll let you review through that. So Mr. Kuhn asked if we were addressing short-term rental issues, and Mr. Kuhn said, yes, we are. We've discussed briefly some of the short-term rentals, and one of the things I was gonna ask Jim for, not our next meeting, because he will not be with us on the 21st, but at our first meeting in March, we wanted to talk about the two open issues that we've mentioned before, were short-term rentals as well as by right zoning. The town has got a lot of feedback on some of that through the LCP process, which Jim is intimately involved with. So we'd like to talk a little bit about that at our first meeting in March. So I expect we'll discuss some of those issues some more at that time. I guess I'll just turn to Jim. I don't know if you had a chance to read Mr. Kuhn's email. Any thoughts you have, Jim? I'm trying to recall. There isn't anything built into the zoning for downtown Hyannis that addresses short-term rental. I know it came up with some of the comments with the consultant at one point. But what exactly, some of the properties we have, there are some agreements not to short-term rent,
Yeah, so,
Wilkins?
so there are some stipulations, but not baked into the zoning essentially is I believe what Mr. Kuhn is referring to and certainly what could be discussed. But for all the units that are deed restricted as affordable are deed restricted as year-round rentals, so those would be year-round. We do have some regulatory agreements, which you guys are intimately familiar with now, downtown that also stipulate year-round rentals. But those market rate units that have been realized by the new downtown or the downtown Hyannis zoning do not have stipulations of year-round rentals. So that certainly is a discussion that could be had here. Those could potentially be short-term rentals in the future, if not addressed. There was a secondary item about parking that I thought I'd
Yeah,
just touch
sure,
on real quick.
address that, yeah.
Yeah, so I was just looking at that, the comments by Mr. Kuhn. And so just to clarify, so the property he's talking about is Wilkins property. So it's not in the downtown Hyannis. So it does have different stipulations in terms of what's required with the zoning. For the Wilkins property, within the subzone of the mixed-use subzone of the medical services overlay district, it's a 1.3 ratio, so 1.3 is required per unit, as well as 1 per every 10 units for guests. So ultimately, the math here with the 320 units that was stated, 32 guests, 416, the 1.3 times 320, 416, so that's 448 required. They're offering 476, or they have proposed, or they've constructed 476, which is 28 parking spaces extra. And so if you think about it, say, okay, well, so they offered a little bit more, so why is that? And sure enough, the rate that they're using, so the requirement again is 1.3, but themselves as the developers looked at and said, we actually want 1.5, and so that's what that rate is. 1.5 is what is actually constructed or proposed at that site for the Wilkins property, using that math. So
I think what it ended up being actually about 1.03 per bedroom as well, right, when you run the calculations as well?
I didn't run it per bedroom.
I think that was in the summary that he had there, so.
Well, so I will state, maybe so, just, Mr. Kuhn states 156 more parking spaces have been proposed, where in reality it was 28 spots that were in excess, is really just wanna highlight that for you guys.
Over the 1.3.
Right, exactly right, so
Okay.
28.
I think he was
spots.
saying, he was comparing that to, I think, the 1 per unit.
Right, exactly, he was
Yeah.
thinking the 1 per unit, probably,
They
I don't wanna
actually-
speak for him,
Yeah,
but
but they actually have a higher requirement.
higher requirement and just parking ratios. And so that 1.5 is what was proposed there for Wilkins, just so for you, just food for thought.
Okay. All right.
It also seems, at least in that final paragraph, he's at least complimenting that particular developer for providing more than what's required in terms of parking spaces, and that if we had a more less scrupulous developer like Wind Development and Bob Brennan, like as he name dropped, then they would crop it as close to the minimum as needed. But then having read that and said that, then I wonder, okay, if we were to bump up the parking minimum to 2 spaces, how would then that quality developer react in that change? And if there were no parking minimums, would they still have the 476 parking spaces? Because even Chris Kuhn himself is saying that he knows, the developer knows what kinds of tenants that they're trying to attract. So it's, at least from the developer side of things, they are creating a property in mind with knowing who is going to pay for the development. And going back into the earlier part of the email, it's kind of funny, almost like kind of ironic that since each landlord's financial strength is different, some more than others will be very challenged with their own financial needs. You could swap out the word landlord for tenant and it would still be the very same on the opposite side of the coin in terms of people looking for a place to rent.
I do think the thing about Wilkins is, I mean, you know, Satchel might say you could live at Wilkins easily and ride a bike and get around or walk, but I think that, I mean, it's close to a grocery store, so in that way, actually, it is, and it's close to a medical center, so in actually that way it is, it's close to Dunkin' Donuts, close to Cumberland Farms. I've never actually walked that way, I don't know about the sidewalks, I mean, there's like soft grass and stuff. But, I mean, maybe, I mean, they have more space at Wilkins, so it's easier to satisfy those requirements probably than here on Main Street. And I don't know if maybe the developer, if we just took finances out of it, would just wanna put 1.49 spaces per unit because it's a little more isolated as opposed to here on Main Street, which is the whole concept of this area is it's supposed to be walkable. You can, you know, go to dinner and eat, you can get a bagel, you can, you know, so I don't know, I'm not the developers on any of these projects, but I think probably location also, besides finances, would impact someone's desire to put in parking or not put in parking and how much space they actually have to do that, so I mean, it's a big piece of property over there, so maybe it's more fiscally doable over there than on Main Street where it's more dense and we don't have as much space, but that's all conjecture.
Well, if space is a premium, then wouldn't you'd be kind of be forced to pay more for that space, so wouldn't you be more sensitive to the amount of money that you are spending on that premium?
I'm saying if you remove the finances from it, like just remove the finances from it and the ability to live in a building, I'm saying, I don't know, I mean, that's why I guess I'm asking your opinion almost, like,
Where is this?
on, over behind BJ's,
Behind
the
BJ's.
Wilkins. You know, like maybe a developer finds that more isolated than say this downtown Main Street district that has things a little bit closer. So I'm removing the finances, I'm just talking about like the literal like feasibility of people moving about the earth, not talking about the finances, so. We could argue on the finances all day long, but I'm just saying,
Well, if you're
I'm
gonna
just
talk,
throwing it out there.
yeah, well, if you're gonna talk about feasibility, that area behind BJ's is surrounded by what, 132, Addicts Lane, a lot more freeways, it's a lot less walkable around that area.
Yeah, that's what I was saying.
Yes.
Yeah. So maybe they need to put more parking in because the people that would be living in that space are more likely to be required to rely on transportation versus living here on Main Street, you can maybe get away with not wanting a car. All conjecture.
So you can get away with not, needing a car behind BJ's, is that?
No.
No, she said just the opposite.
The opposite?
Yeah.
So you need a car behind BJ's,
Uh-huh.
but you don't need one on Main Street.
That's, I think, part of the argument of reducing parking here is that this area is less reliant on needing cars to live and work here. As opposed to being over behind BJ's where it's maybe not as pedestrian and biker friendly, that you might need a car if you're living over in that part of Hyannis.
Would you say that's common sense?
Seth, I don't wanna get in an argument with you.
It's not an argument,
I'm just stating a fact. If you wanna disagree with me, just state your disagreement. I'm not here to get in a rhetorical argument or conversation. I'm just stating my opinion. Either if you agree with
I'm
it,
trying to follow your logic.
take it for how you see it, Seth. I've stated my position. It's either logical to you or illogical,
well,
just move on from that.
You can repeat, could you please repeat again?
I think the whole point of the downtown zoning was to make this a walkable and bikeable area, requiring less cars. I think potentially over in Wilkins, there's more space and it's not as walker and bike friendly, so it may require more parking to house those people and get them from point A to point B.
Okay, I can follow that, and if that's the case, I mean, I do believe that, then why do we have in writing that certain properties need a certain amount of parking?
I think that's the whole point of having a parking minimum is to be able to satisfy the lifestyle of the people inhabiting the buildings.
That's not the point of the parking minimum, that kind of goes against what I'm trying to argue for. The parking minimum wouldn't be required, would it force or incentivize a developer to make that parking in the first place? Because they already knew what kinds of tenants they would need to provide for.
Okay, perfect.
I have a couple of questions for Jim, if you don't mind, on parking, right? So, as Satchel said, the size of the space, it's 9 by 18. That's like for just a sedan, like a regular sort of, I would call it a medium-sized car, right? So,
Smaller or bigger.
yeah, so a lot of people who are living here drive these, and I'm just making an observation. I don't count cars, you know, but they drive these big.
I got a pickup truck, you can say it, it's all right.
Okay. And that truck isn't gonna fit in these 9 by 18 spaces.
It does, it fits nicely. The bumper is gonna stick out a little bit, and I just cross my fingers no one hits it, but it fits just fine.
I'm just thinking that, you know, the spaces are kind of on the small side for the trucks, you know,
It is.
and I just don't know if the parking regulation that we have allows for, and we can use Wilkins as an example because apparently there's a lot of space there, right? Why doesn't Wilkins provide a certain area of their parking where the spaces are a little bigger to accommodate the trucks? Is that something that could be baked into the zoning?
You certainly could. I think that it runs on the same premise of, do you really want to plan for the largest extent?
Right.
You know, when we're
Right.
planning neighborhoods, we're not saying, we're not trying to build a road that 2 fire trucks can go side by side, because the opportunity of that happening is so minimum, and then fire trucks are trained to know how to maneuver through an area. So we're not looking for the 11-foot wide by 11-foot wide.
Right.
But you certainly can, if you think that's the priority, you certainly could make a bigger parking spot.
To me, it's a waste of space, but,
Right.
but,
And so, but yeah, there are certainly spaces 9 by 20, 10 by 20 even.
Right.
I mean, a pickup truck is essentially 20 feet long.
but I think our public commenters today bring up really important points that we've talked about before with regard to parking. And it is, you know, we're working towards this ideal of a walkable and bikeable community. We're not there yet. We're getting closer every day, and Satchel, I applaud you for, you know, moving here into a walkable community. I've lived in them before. They're wonderful. It's wonderful to not have a car and to worry about, as you said, Seth, the insurance and the cost of the car and all that. In some parts of the community, I'm not sure that we're really there yet. We're moving towards that, and I think maybe some of the developments can incentivize the owners or people who are living there to adopt different lifestyles, because there is only room for one car, let's say, and the second person living in the apartment or dwelling maybe only works a few miles away and could bike. I'm just using that as an example. I'm just making it up. So I think that your comments are really important. In some areas, I'm not sure that we're really there yet. We need to drive more public transportation too. I think public transportation is a really important component to that. And you have this sort of chicken and egg scenario. Do you add more routes to public transportation before you have the housing? Do you have the housing before you have the public transportation routes? It's one of these like push-pull sort of things, and I don't know the answer. I'm just saying that those kinds of things are going on. That push-pull thing is going on already in some of the communities already. But so I was just curious about the larger trucks. And then you talked about the deed restrictions for affordable housing. Do the deed restrictions with respect to short-term rentals also occur with workforce housing? Workforce housing is 80%, 80 to 120% AMI.
So above 80%
Right.
workforce housing. So
Are those deed restricted?
yeah, so they they can be, but it depends on how they're permitted. So we don't, in our inclusionary housing, we don't have an option for workforce housing. So that workforce housing, the 80 to 100, has to come from some other mechanism, such as a regulatory agreement or some other avenue. I mean, there could be negotiations where they offer a little bit additional affordables, and that those additional affordables could be that workforce housing option where you then could deed restrict. But right now, there isn't a zoning mechanism for that locally.
That's interesting.
I'll just make a couple of comments, we'll address the public commenters too.
That's interesting.
I think regarding the parking, and correct me if I'm wrong, Jim, but when we kind of started this process, well, first of all, it's been more Satchel than just a couple of random public commenters that have commented about the parking. If anything, it's been a lot larger for people asking for an increase in parking rather than reducing it or keeping minimums. But I think the general consensus was, if I'm not mistaken, Jim, that one was not enough. It wasn't taken into consideration, no more than the Wilkins. You talked about how that has visitor parking. Even if people only have one car or no car and live on Main Street, people have visitors. So none of that was baked into it. The handicap, I don't believe that was included in that. So the one spot per unit was, I think we all kind of knew that that was too low. And I think we've had a lot of comment from residents, from businesses, other people saying that that's too low. So just to share with you what we've heard from the public, what we've kind of got into the process. So I think going into it to begin with, I think we felt that the one probably needed to be adjusted and just what that would be. So I think that was kind of a consensus going into the process, and we've had a lot of feedback from residents and businesses with that comment. So that's kind of where we've gotten to the point where we're talking about the increase, what that would be. So that's what we've heard from the public and comments and, based on information we've received from the town. So I would just address that. That's some of the feedback that we've heard from the public on the parking.
I will say I do appreciate Chris's point when it comes to the incentive to turn the vacancies into short-term rentals and that there being no provision to prevent that. And that's an interesting insight that I did not consider. However, the next paragraph, the Hyannis BID and the Main Street merchants might actually want all these apartments to be run like a motel so that it'll bring more tourists into the area, who are much more apt to spend money, which that makes complete sense, than tenants who can barely afford their rent and might opt to shoplift instead. I think there's a kind of a gap between being desperate enough to shoplift and just wanting to afford rent.
Right. Yeah, that's pretty an extreme comment. We just have to absorb it and kind of.
One thing I'll say about if allowing these short-term rentals will give incentive for people to buy them for investment properties instead of year-round housing. That's part of the problem. I think we should, personally, I think every one of these developments should have a restrict short-term rentals. Second thing is it's pretty standard that short-term rentals actually need more parking spaces or use more parking spaces than a year-round or a regular rental, because people come from different places to share the unit and they bring multiple cars. You'll see that in neighborhoods all the time, that a lot of people will come for that short-term rental for a week and they'll ask 5 friends and each of them comes from different areas and they show up, and that's part of the problem we have with overcrowding in the houses. So that's something to keep in mind. I definitely think short-term rentals should be discouraged at the least to keep these from being not used as year-round housing, which is what we need.
Yeah, I mean, I think most of you have seen, I know I sent something to Jim, I think if you saw the governor's housing study came out this week, and in many ways kind of contradicts what we've heard from some of the housing groups in the Cape Cod Commission, that, and we've heard this before, the housing director for the town 4 or 5 years ago, Arden Cadron, said, we don't have a problem with the number of housing units in Barnstable, it's the way they're used. And the state has now come to that acknowledgement too, and even some of the housing hack and others have begun to acknowledge that part of the issue is, the short-term rental, the conversion of houses into rentals, the vacancies that are sitting here, these properties aren't being used. So, what they're saying we really need, the state's own study is, 2.5%, which again, I'd like to get together with Jim and talk about that a little bit more, the numbers and stuff. But, that would certainly be a lot smaller number than the numbers that the Cape Cod Commission's talking about, 11 to 22,000. So there's a real disconnect there in some of those numbers that we're seeing. And again, I think people have begun to acknowledge that part of the issue is not that we don't have enough housing units, it's how they're being used. And some of that needs to be done through policy and regulations, and zoning's one of those things. Implementation of some sort of short-term rental regs as well, that can address some of those needs, so. I think that's something, yes, Kristen?
Jim, when you mentioned that some of the regulatory agreements have in them requirements for year-round rentals, how did that come to be? Was it something that the town said, and could you give us an example of a project and give us the details on that?
Yeah, so in a regulatory agreement, it's exactly what it is. It's an agreement between two parties, it's a contractual agreement between two parties. So through the process, there's negotiations. Obviously, as we're talking on the table now, I mean, year-round housing is a priority. So the planning board recognized that, the town council at the time recognized that, and that was negotiated. Trying to think off the top of my head which regulatory agreements recently required that. I'll give you an example at the next meeting if that's okay. I don't wanna make assumptions. But yeah, it can, in a regulatory agreement, that's one benefit, it's a open negotiation. Whereas if it's going through a by right process, or even sometimes in a special permit process, you don't have that wiggle room.
Yeah, and then Mr. Kuhn had an interesting comment. He talked about the use of regulatory agreements in some of these projects, which I guess we've seen a lot less regulatory agreements, right, Jim, since the downtown IM zoning, which we need to dust off the memo, because we started that early, but that's still out there too. But that was an interesting thought, if you want to somehow address that issue with the short-term rentals and make sure the housing is used the way we need it to be done, and maybe a regulatory agreement is a method to do that, so.
Well, so, the rationale, as we talked early on about regulatory agreements is it's a negotiation, but if we have priorities we have identified, let's bake it in the zoning, so so it's a known requirement for developers up front when they're doing it, and it also, identifies the priorities the town wants, so if we want to have year-round housing, we can certainly work on.
I think that's preferable, yeah. Okay.
So that sort of brings a natural question that I have, is about enforcement. We have we have affordable housing that's deed restricted, and we know that short-term rentals are not allowed for those units. Do we know if that's in fact happening? Or if there's some deviation from the agreement? I don't know that. Do you know that?
So by and large, so we have what's called monitoring agents for all the affordable units. Not all of them are done through private monitoring agents, some are the town. And so that's kind of the limiting factor, and that's where I talked to some of the counselors about supporting potentially a regional housing services office. And that regional housing services office could provide just that, a monitoring agent for all the communities across the Cape. Because that's one administrative task that we're limited on. We have over 700 affordable units, and so monitoring all of those as well as monitoring the monitors is a requirement or necessary to know for sure whether or not they are meeting the standards. So at this time, there are a number of them that we still need monitoring agents for, and so we're looking at avenues to achieve that, and one of them is that regional housing services office.
Okay.
John?
Jim, are we still using host compliance for some of the issues? We hired them to keep an eye on short-term rentals, a couple of things.
Right, yeah, through the building department?
Yes, so we're still using host compliance.
Yes.
Looking at what the governor put out, that the demand for housing should go up about 2.5% on the Cape and Islands. Okay, so this is a different from what we've been looking at, a lot smaller. And right now, I think the percentages of short-term rentals in town are somewhere between 3% and 5%. There's 750 units. Converting most of those, or a good percentage of those, will get us to 2.5%. And that's what we need is regulations to discourage that from the people who used to do it year-round, but found out it was so much more lucrative to do it for 3 months in the summer. So I still think that would go a long way on our housing compliance percentages than building every empty lot in the whole town, you see what I mean? So I think that's something we should really concentrate on if that's what our it's under the auspices of this committee.
And I think what we're saying when we say that, you know, we need less housing, nobody's denying we need more affordable and more
Yes.
workforce housing. But we're talking about, you know, if we've gotta build 1,000 units to get 10% of that or 100 affordable, you know, we're,
It's not
the
enough.
scale, that just doesn't make
It's not enough.
sense. You know, we're not set up to do that, the infrastructure, that we've gotta find a way to take the housing stock we have and make sure that we create more affordable and, you know, and more workforce housing within that stock, so.
Well, that's kind of, why wouldn't you reframe it in a way where instead of thinking that I need 1,000 units, so that 10% of those units, 100 would be affordable, and just make 500 units that are set to the market? And
That's-
finding out a way where it is let's put it in terms of being profitable, but makes sense commercially from the developer's point of view and the tenant's point of view. Because currently, right now, you might say that there is only 10% of any development that gets built, 10% that's affordable. However, the median rent is still above what is affordable for the people who are looking for places to live on Cape. And according to the documents that I wanna say Kristen posted, for the Cape Cod Housing Needs Assessment and the traffic metric patterns assessment from the Concord Group, a quarter of the people that work in Barnstable live off Cape. Meaning that if they were able to, they more than likely would live on Cape if they could afford to. However, they are working in jobs more than likely that are in the service industry and the healthcare industry that pay less, much less than the median household income on Cape. So either they're maybe working 2 jobs, or they have to live with multiple people underneath the same household in order to afford their rent in Barnstable. So we can try to stem the use of short-term rentals, but it doesn't really address the affordability issue of housing on Cape. And if we don't address that, then we gotta consider the consequences of what would happen if people either move away or if they have to consolidate into larger households.
I'm not sure I get your point exactly, Seth.
That's fair.
So are you advocating just building as much as we can to get the price down? Is that, I'm not sure, cause then.
Well, it's a combination.
Then you get into the situation is then, you know, do we have the infrastructure? Do we have the ability to build that much? Do you change the entire character of where people are living? You know, it's a fine dance, there's no doubt about it and stuff. But I think, you know, you've got to find a way to adjust those policies to address both needs. I agree with you. I sent Jim an article and we talked a little bit about it. There's a project up in Truro, is that where that was, Jim? Where they were building the 53 units, 49 of which were affordable, you know, as opposed to Wilkins building 320 and I don't know what the number was, it's affordable.
42.
So, the difference here with Cloverleaf and Truro is that was town disposed land. And just there's, I don't know how much of my commentary to interject here, but if the town purchases, if the town is the entity driving the production of housing, then yes, you can have a 55 unit complex where 50 of those are affordable at 80% AMI or up to 120, whatever. The open market obviously is entirely different. Yeah, it's
And that's one of the things is we know that Barnstable has excess land, and that's part of the LCP is talking about doing that. Looking at properties
Yeah.
like that, I understand a private development versus that, and Jim and I talked a little bit about that. So saying there's gotta be ways to find
yeah.
ways to do both of those,
A
so.
lot of these towns, a lot of the towns, at least on the lower and outer Cape, that are doing this are amending they can't build, like Chatham, the town of Chatham has two different, affordable developments going in right now. They need to change their zoning anyways, because if they want built X many houses, their zoning, it still doesn't work for their zoning, so either way, the zoning needs to be overridden in 40B, which slows up the process and allows abutters to sue and creates red tape, and it takes 15 years and so on and so forth. And so my professional opinion is you allow for that flexibility across the board, whether it's whether it's a developer making private whatever, market rate, whatever, or it's town disposed land asking for affordable, the less hoops a developer has to jump through on behalf of themselves or on behalf of the town, the easier it is to create that housing in the first place. You kind of can't do one without the other.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I think we've got a couple more people who joined us, interested in making comment.
Not yet. Is there more time later?
We're gonna close public comment.
Okay,
Yeah,
I was notified late. So I really just, I'm glad to
you're here.
be here and hear what y'all are talking
Sure.
about. But I wasn't able to prepare anything.
Okay.
I just wanted to be,
Sure.
yeah, so.
We've got several more meetings, so they're posted always, so you're
Yeah,
welcome to join us in the future.
I appreciate that. I appreciate
Okay.
asking too.
Great,
And you can
Thank you.
always email us.
Okay.
yeah, that's right.
If you
We're glad you're
think
here,
you wanna write something.
Yeah.
You get your thoughts, you can
Yeah.
always email us too, so.
I appreciate that.
Also, just like one more thing, just even the term affordable housing and what affordable means. AMI, annual median income, measures across the Cape. So are we kind of assuming that, generally speaking, someone who lives in West Barnstable, Hyannis, Falmouth, Orleans, Provincetown, they're all making roughly the same amount of money, evenly distributed?
Well, it's an average, so I think, I'm not great.
Median.
I'm not great at math, but I think it's kind of bringing it together. It's not saying everybody does it. You're gonna have your high earners and your low earners, and when you do the math equation,
Well, there's a distribution, which is what
Yeah.
really want to get at.
Yeah.
So if you were to take, say, if you were to like really localize and really disaggregate that data and take, say, the median of the average household, median of a household in West Barnstable and compare that to, say, Hyannis.
I think they did that. Didn't they do that, Jim?
Referring to the area median income?
Yes.
Like looking at that, household breakdowns in different villages and I
So,
thought I read that somewhere.
yeah, so
I could be wrong.
there are for census tracts, but for the area median income, it is just Barnstable County wide.
So all of Cape Cod.
All of Cape Cod as it's defined as the area median income. Very similarly, Boston, Cambridge, Quincy is the AMI is large ring that almost goes to Worcester and down to the Rhode Island border. So it's very large, and those are defined by HUD, the federal
Yeah.
government.
So even in that case, it's kind of like weird where you would compare families, say, from Weston,
Yeah.
Brookline,
Oh, yeah.
to a family in Roxbury, Mattapan. So on Cape, you're comparing a family or a household or two roommates that live in a danky apartment in Hyannis compared to maybe a software engineer who works from home in West Barnstable. And we're using that metric for affordability, for median income.
Not necessarily by choice, but by law.
By choice, yeah, by law.
I don't know.
So it's.
I don't know how you do that. I mean, what do you can do by block or neighborhood? Yeah, I mean,
Or
you
zip code by
can't.
zip code, at least if you want to use data that is publicly available to get something that's at least more closer to reality.
Yeah, I mean, I'd venture to bad that nobody in the country does that.
Yeah, so I mean, it's done through HUD because, yeah, it creates some consistency when we're talking about that affordable definition, when we're essentially defining that back to the state to say these units are affordable, because all of these that are not workforce, say 80% and below, we have to, or we don't have to, but the applicant, the developer has to certify that they're doing it by the state law, and the state reviews that. And they turn to HUD and those numerical figures for confirmation. So that's how it plays out. I mean, we could look at it for other programs, I guess. We could look at different affordable rates. But in terms of defining an affordable unit for a deed restriction, we're kind of bound by it.
Yeah, I understand that we're bound by law, that's just how it is, like, that's just like the way that things are, but systemically speaking, I can understand like how things may be separate from like what we see on the ground versus like what we would see in a spreadsheet.
Yeah, I qualify for affordable housing. I think that's gross. I don't think I should ever be applying for affordable housing. But I could legally. That makes no sense. Like, I have a consistent, steady paycheck and I can afford my bills, and I mean, so I think to your point is, you know, that number might not really represent the actual struggle that people have to afford a place to live, and it might actually impact, it widens the pool of people that in theory could be applying for those programs, as opposed to actually making it accessible to the people who really need to be in those programs.
Then can we infer from that then impacts the actual housing need that we have?
How so?
I don't follow that. I have my own house and I'm not asking anybody to pay for it.
Well,
So even though I could apply for it, I'm not doing that. So I'm not actually interjecting myself into the system. So it's not like I'm taking up, let's say we have 1,000 seats on the bus and I'm not now asking for seat number 999 and then somebody else doesn't get on the bus because I've applied. So I mean, there are probably people out there that do that might actually apply for programs when maybe they don't really need them. I mean, in that level, yeah, I guess I could see how that would impact it, but I just think the widening of the pay scale and the way the numbers are calculated and the number of people that move to Cape Cod impacting that number, we now have this higher, AMI, and so the people, it's just stratifying and separating us even more, and those people down here are still struggling. We haven't fixed the problem or helped the problem for those people very much. They're still struggling.
So if the AMI has increased, but the cost of living has much increased much higher than that, then would that not suggest that the cost of living is accelerating at a pace that the AMI realistically cannot match in terms of affordability?
That's sort of an esoteric argument, because we don't have any influence over that. It's set by HUD, the AMIs, and it's something that we just have to deal with. It's just not something we can change. So we're just basically arguing about it.
We can't change that, but then on this committee, could we at least have zoning policies that are more friendly to the increase of housing?
Well, I think our problem now is these large housing developments are taking up a majority of the resources that are available. A letter from the Barnstable Fire Department came out last week that said, talking about the Wilkins second phase, that they're not sure they can provide, it's in Barnstable, whether they can provide the water for it, because there's so many units. So I think we're shooting ourselves in the foot by going for these large projects at this point. We should be concentrating more on higher amounts of affordable in the units we're building on a smaller scale. I think that's what we should be
And I think, to your comment, Seth, I mean, how many units do we have under construction? I mean, we've got, what,
Well,
900?
in permitting over 1,000.
Yeah, so I think it's pretty hard to say that we're not doing what the town can do to do the housing and stuff. So I think we, are housing friendly and we're doing all the things, we're just talking about tweaking a few of the things that, you know, people have some concerns with. Our intent was never to rewrite the zoning. I think the town is doing the things it needs to do to address those issues and stuff, so, at least that's my personal opinion, so.
I agree, but I think most of those units, there's a very small percentage, or 10% or less, or whatever, affordable. So we're building a huge amount of units, and we're not really hitting the problem we need with just 2.5% more housing. So are we counting that 2.5%, the 1,000 units that are already permitted? Is the state counting those?
I can look back at the sources that the state used. They didn't contact us to get those numbers, so.
Interesting to know, because maybe we're way over at this point.
What I'd love to
But not
see, Seth,
affordable. That's the problem.
is that of those 1,000 units, a higher percentage of those, and that's one of the things we've talked about as a committee, I don't know if you were at the meeting or not, but we talked about increasing the inclusionary amount, going from the 10%, because we think that needs to be done. And I know the housing ad hoc is also thinking about doing that, so we want to address those issues and stuff. I think what we're trying to say is we don't want out of control market rate, you know, using up the resources, the infrastructure, just to get to that number. We find another way to get to the increase in affordable units, whether it's increasing the inclusionary amount or just, you know, just how we do that, and, you know, to be determined and stuff. But I don't think you can argue that the town is not doing a lot to try and increase the housing with 1,000 units in production and more that are coming. So, like I said, that's my personal opinion. So.
It's a lot of units, and like I said, but
More need to be
we still
affordable.
don't have the affordable
Yeah.
working
Yeah.
level, and that's what we're
Exactly.
trying to get to. We've got plenty of units coming on, but they're not gonna service the community or the purposes we're trying to reach at this town. Which means, you know, if a unit comes in and you've gotta put 10%, well, why can't we? Well, we gotta figure out if it's feasible, both in, from a profitability standpoint and a loan available standpoint for the construction company to do it, the developer. And so that's a fine line, but I think we're trying to do that, go with more of a high requirement for inclusionary units in each new development. But the more we build on the denominator and the less we build on the numerator, we're never gonna get to that 10%, of affordable units. And so I just think we should concentrate more on smaller but more inclusionary units of the developments we're talking about, and to get more affordable units.
Even the smaller developments.
Yeah.
I would say even the smaller developments.
I agree.
Yeah. I think, let's say, you want to continue on this, I think we'd like to move on to D, which is, Jim, just a little more discussion of the draft from last week, just kind of pick up where we were last time. I think we had the 2 or 3 areas that we were looking at. Our next meeting, Jim will not be in attendance, right, Jim?
That's correct.
So, I thought what we would do at our next meeting, a little bit more of just kind of a working session where we'll talk about some of those, you know, and maybe review what we decide to put into some of those items. But again, just kind of, if you want to summarize where we were at, Jim, the 3 areas that we discussed, I guess. And any other comments and questions, then we can talk about it more at the next meeting, so.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
All right, so we refer back to the memo draft with dated most recently January 24th,
Right.
2025. And I think at the last meeting, we discussed the changes to the parking section as well as the heights. Happy to go back over those if we want as a refresher. Or
Jim, do you have your presentation
I do.
up that shows the boundaries, the district boundaries?
All right, good. I can get it back up in 2 seconds. Also have the solar if you'd like.
Yeah, that's right.
Let's open that up now. Want to share screen perhaps? With people not here. All right, so the downtown in a zoning vision, so we've seen this a few times. These are the 7 districts in the downtown Hyannis zoning. And so when we're talking about the 3rd section, which is the district boundaries, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we were talking really predominantly about the area that's shaded like a light purple. So that's the DV, that's the downtown village district. And that has many of the same attributes as the downtown Main Street district. And so as you see on the left, those are really the 2 form-based zoning changes. Whereas the rest, the downtown neighborhood, the hospital harbor, train station center highway, those all have some attributes of form-based, but a lot more of the traditional zoning where there's enhanced setbacks, traditionally one principal structure, and not as much density as those of the form-based. So when we're talking about those areas to the edges, I think when we talked about those images from last time, and maybe I can get over to that. Yeah, there we go. So, yeah, these are the 3 real areas that we had highlighted at least last time, and those images of the single family and the smaller multifamily, those are really on the edges towards just north of North Street there. That's where Lewis is and Winter, et cetera. So if we skip over to, let's see, through parking, yeah, the district boundary. So these images again that we spent some time on last time, these are generally speaking in the purple north of North Street, and then over towards where it says Main Street in the light purple on the right side. Those are these neighborhoods there. And right now they're allowed for the downtown village, which again is 4 stories. 0 setbacks.
4 or 3?
4 in the
4?
downtown village,
Okay.
yes.
In the village, okay, yeah, sorry, that's right.
Yep. And so the discussion was whether or not to transition downtown village to downtown neighborhood, and that is the maximum of 3 stories.
Right.
With the building standards being the principal building, 3-story, use provision, sorry. So in section D on that left side, use provisions allows for less density in this area. So it still allows for office and healthcare clinics, because if you recall in these areas, there are a number of those. And that's actually what the area of the light purple where it says North Street, that light purple area, that actually was the office zoning district back in the 2000s. That's where the town was prioritizing office. And that's why when you walk around, you say, why on earth is there a car dealership there? That's why, because the zoning said put a car dealership there. Whereas now we're saying, well, maybe that wasn't the highest and best use for downtown Hyannis. And so changing that to more of a residential area. So this would allow for multi-unit dwellings are permitted, maximum of 4 dwelling units in any one building per lot. So you would ultimately the maximum build out there, if you were to use the DN district, would be those 4 units, and then we have to be mindful of the fact that there is that ADU ordinance that is and updated by the state, so an ADU would potentially be allowed there as well, depending on that if you have the space for it.
Are there any lots that are bigger where more than 4 units would be appropriate?
I would in the DV right
Yeah,
now, I would
yeah.
say absolutely. There is plenty of
Because
lots.
right now you're limiting it to 4 plus potential ADU, right?
In the DN, the downtown neighborhood, yes.
So my question relates to the DN. Are there any lots there that are big enough that would allow for more than 4 units?
Well, I would say
I don't know that.
could more than 4 units be constructed on those lots? 100%. whether you would, yeah, I think that's in the eye of the beholder and the
Yeah.
discussion being had, because
Right.
I would say there was one lot on School Street that was recently for sale. It had 3 units already in that building. A developer came by and thought it was in the DB,
Oh.
thinking maybe I could get a little bit more in there and maybe I could put a second building behind it. And I sat down with him and said, this is in the downtown neighborhood, you could potentially, if it's practical, get another unit in that building. But no, not with the downtown neighborhood, you could not add another structure, you cannot add more density beyond those 4. So there's certainly, from a practical standpoint, you certainly could. I think it's a discussion of priority and neighborhood scale that is being discussed here.
Okay.
So Jim, what we're saying between the dark purple and the light purple, currently as written, the light purple is 4 stories,
That's correct.
0 setbacks.
So this is the requirements in the light purple. Let me move, sorry everyone, I'm gonna move you out of the way here. So right now in the light purple, this is basically the code. So right now you can do up to 4 stories. The little footnote is that 8-foot setback. Building width, maximum of 120 feet, so you can't go any longer than 120 feet before you have to adjust the facade depth. Again, let's see, setbacks, 0 minimum, 15 maximum, so we're saying you can't go any further than 15 feet from the property line, you gotta try and pull it closer to the sidewalk. Rear setbacks, side setbacks, again, 0 minimum. So that's what is in the downtown village, which is that light purple, which is this area here. I can show you real quick, I think I have the Main Street one still on here as well. Yep, there we go, there's the Main Street one, and the DV doesn't differ all that much. The DM allows for a slightly longer building, which typically would, bigger massing. But the setbacks you can see are the same. Let's see, the lot coverage is a little bit different, so you have to have a little bit more greenery in the light purple.
And what you have written here, under potential recommendations to the town, on the second paragraph, you're saying amending section F of the table, number of stories from 3.5 or 4 to a maximum of 3. Maybe allowing 3.5 if the rooftop is proposed to have active space. Do we really wanna have active space in those areas?
Well, the other option was the next paragraph, which was the district boundaries, which was to go to the neighborhood district, which would not
Right,
include
so
that.
those are 2 different topics, I think, so you're talking building
I'm talking about
height.
the second
Yeah,
paragraph.
okay, yeah, that's right, I'm sorry,
Because
so,
these are potential recommendations,
Yes.
there's 3 paragraphs, so
Yeah.
the first one we talked about, which is taking the downtown Main Street area and making it from 3.5 or 4 down to 3 with an optional story if that space is being utilized for something. And now we're saying in the light purple area, a maximum of 3 and allowing for a 3.5 story if the rooftop is proposed to have active space.
I think I see where you're saying, Bob, you're talking about if you were to change the DV to DN, that would essentially be moot, right? So
that's what, you would strike that, yeah, that's what it was, so.
But if you didn't and it stayed DV, I think that's a conversation you should have. I think that's what the conversation was the last go around, though maybe everyone was thinking more of the Main Street as opposed to the village. But certainly that's a conversation to be had.
I think some of the concerns we've heard is that, with the light purple and the dark purple, was that in that,
So you get that
mixed up the downtown. What's that?
The village is the light
The
purple.
village.
Yep.
Yeah, was that the height of those buildings, like you had over near Independence House, where you had like a, was that a 4? 3.5,
Yeah.
right next to, a smaller house in there, that there wasn't any kind of a graduated, you just like you have a 4 stories right up to, a single family home, 1 story. And the thought was to somehow graduate that through adjusting the boundaries. Jim suggested the one one option, like you said, is the second paragraph. So you'd essentially have the same 3 with a half story in both the dark purple and the light purple if you did that. Or we would say, make all the light purple the downtown neighborhood, which would cap it at 3 stories.
That's correct.
Okay. So it's a little bit more, which is, you already have a 3-story there. The neighborhoods there, like you said, a lot of those homes are, multiple units already. The comment came from people, Charlie made the comment, people who live there, the neighborhoods that, it maintains the neighborhood feel in that district by going to the downtown neighborhood for the light purple. I mean, that was the thought. That makes sense, or just confuse it more?
But also, it doesn't have to be as strict, it doesn't have to be, change light purple to yellow just because we think that's a good next step. You could be a little more nuanced with it too, it could be.
New district,
Yeah, creating a new district or creating multiple new districts, that's certainly something to discuss as well.
Jim, just a question, in these areas, these lots are a variety of sizes, a lot of them pretty small.
Yes.
And have you had any activity in there of people trying to apply the new regulations to these areas?
To the, in the DB or?
Well, more specifically, like this area and this area. Sorry.
Yes, absolutely. We had a number of infill projects already. Specifically in this area, a number of successful projects, meaning gone through permitting and is currently constructing. Same thing here, actually in both of those locations. Yes, there has been a number of successful permitted projects.
In the heights on those?
All of them are 2.5 story. Yeah, those are all the duplexes. There's a couple slightly more dense. We actually walked some of them over Mr. Dewey's property and beyond to Mr. Hansen's property and around.
I guess my fear is that like that Main Street, that light purple area on the right, which seems like smaller lots, more neighborhoodish.
Yeah.
The thought of like even 3 stories and then allowing like a rooftop on there kind of makes me a little uncomfortable. I mean, maybe I could see it like 1 street off of Main Street because maybe our business area expands, and more restaurants and bars come in or something like coffee shops or something with some housing on top. I mean, I guess I can kind of see that, but I feel like that Main Street area, that light purple area is fairly residential. I could be wrong. Is there a lot?
It's mostly residential, multifamily residential, and a lot of offices.
Yeah.
There are a lot of medical
So,
offices and others.
So not like super commercial spaces, there's
Right.
not like, there's not,
I don't think there's any restaurants in that stretch or anything.
And don't we have the old 7-Eleven on North, that's a 4-story, right?
Yeah, it's down this way.
Yeah.
Right in here, I think.
So we do have one that's going into the full 4 stories, right?
Yes, the 3.5 stories, I think technically, but yes, it's the size of what a 4-story would be. Yeah.
The question is, do we wanna scale down as we go north in this case, or go east in this case? With a half story less, or have the whole thing, the dark cranberry, which is.
The Cranberry is the main street, so that's
Yeah, I know,
that's the
that's what I'm
4-story, yeah.
But, yeah, go down to 3 stories. And the setbacks, that's one thing, it shouldn't be a setback of a certain, like we were talking about that one on Stevens Street or whatever, the church. There was no setback at all.
Right.
Should seem to be like, there should be like a 5 to 10 foot setback or something like that with residential, from the district change to residential or.
Yeah, so in the downtown neighborhood, there are setbacks, side setback is 10, rear is 20.
Front
And
is
so
10.
so there are some setbacks in DN. The downtown Main Street, there aren't any, but that's the traditional pattern, I would say, on Main Street. You think about it as you're walking down, if you're on the sidewalk, you can touch the building, that's 0 setback. But yes, the downtown village, I would say it's not as straightforward. There's not as many of those structures where you're like, okay, it's right on the streets, there are a lot of setbacks, and so, yeah.
Well, I think in the downtown village, are we asking, you know, right now it's 3.5, is that what we get?
Right now it's 4.
4, so we asking 4, we want 4-story residential buildings that can feed into Main Street, businesses and that kind of stuff, will go down to, 3. It's a question of moving into a more residential area
with a
versus
setback
a
as
more
well.
commercial area.
Yeah.
So what are we still trying to figure that out, I
Do
assume?
you know the 7-Eleven on North
Yes,
Street?
I haven't seen the building there.
But I
yet.
mean,
I
yeah,
know where it
but
is.
you know how 7-Eleven is set back and there's a parking lot?
Yeah,
Now imagine that building will be right
Right up to the sidewalk.
right up to the sidewalk,
4 stories.
Yeah.
4 stories. Or
And-
3, I mean, depending on
And everything else, like the
whatever your
Burger King
permits.
sits back and everything else. And the
It's kind of weird.
Volvo dealership, yeah, that's kind of.
That one, whether lucky or not lucky, they are using the existing foundation, so they're using
It
a
will be-
pre-existing, so it's gonna be set back.
Okay.
Yeah, but yeah, I get your point. It could have been moved up.
So I would just say, generally speaking, in the lighter purple, I would want to see a setback from the front. Because I feel really strongly that we have a responsibility to implement zoning regulations that allow for street trees to reduce the urban heat island effect. Because essentially we're exposing all the residents in the areas where there are no trees to stinking hot summer temperatures and very expensive energy bills in the summer to cool those properties. And nobody's gonna be outside. So you're stuck inside. I think that just creates in my mind, that's a terrible living experience. So I would say in the lighter purple, we need to have a property boundary setback. From the developer's perspective, they're gonna try to max out what they can put on that property.
Sure.
So if you say, maybe you can have a setback, you have to tell them they have to have a setback,
Yeah.
but they're just gonna take it all up, in the front. And I think
I
the front is the best place for that
I
to
would
be.
100% agree with you, as long as you would also add in a removal of parking minimums, because parking 100% also adds to that urban heat island effect as well.
Yeah,
So say that again?
So not just the built environment, but parking as well. Parking is probably
Yeah.
greater than buildings because of surface area
Yeah.
in terms of adding
so
to the urban heat island
there's
effect.
something in there which talks about percentage of lot coverage with impervious
Yeah.
cover.
And what is the parking?
Can you just
on,
show-
So
go
it's
back to that.
impervious, so depending on where you are, so the DN, the downtown neighborhood, the lot coverage is 50%, so half of it has to be impervious, meaning that, it's grass area or something similar. Downtown village, all right, let me go to both of them there, the one with downtown village and downtown, Main Street, you can 100% maximize the lot coverage, whereas though in reality you kind of can't because there's those landscaping requirements and other stuff.
Yeah,
But there 100% of the non-landscape area can be covered, whereas the downtown village it's 80%, so 20% of it can be impervious, or it has to be impervious.
Does that impervious include gravel, or pervious include gravel?
It does.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
so
when we wanna discourage having people just make parking spots that they're doing all over town on old grassing areas that are in the front setback. And
Yeah.
it is pervious because it's gravel, but then everything's in front and we're defeating the purpose of doing that
Yeah.
for the setback, which we want some trees and some greenery.
That's where the importance of the tree conservation ordinance is there, which should require a shade tree in the front yard.
I have a question. Again, math's not my strong suit. So in the light purple, if the primary front setback is 0 and the secondary, what's the secondary front?
Which one, were you talking about Main Street or
What's B?
Village?
What is a secondary front setback?
So if you're on like a corner lot, for instance, so you have your primary, so the busiest way basically, and then your side streets, that would be the secondary.
Okay, and then you could have your other side setback is 0, and then your rear setback is 0? So basically, in this zone, we can, if this is my property, I can build my building all on here, then how do you get 80% maximum lot coverage?
So you see that there's not a maximum setback, so you can go to the rear and you can go to the side, but you're not required to get to that rear and side setback. So the front is the key, that we want the building, or the zoning says, we want the buildings closer to the front, whether that's your primary and your secondary, or if you just have one frontage. And then you're hiding your parking in the back. So the building's up front, and you're putting all the other stuff in the back. So you don't have to go all the way to zero setback rear. You don't have to go all the way to the side, zero setback.
You literally can't though, if you have only 80% lot coverage.
Exactly right. So it would be one or the other maybe.
Okay.
You could say, you know what, I'm gonna make a more narrow building.
Yeah.
Because I gotta get that 20% over here, or I'm gonna put my 20% back here. And
Yeah,
John's
they still have to
point,
satisfy
a lot of
the
it's the
Yeah,
parking.
yeah, so in some way, although the fear is if this is
Yeah,
the property and I'm worried a developer's gonna build on every square inch, they literally can't, they can only build on this much, cause this
80%.
is the 20% I have to maintain. Now, whether I wanna do it here or here or here or here,
That's exactly right.
okay, just trying to get that concept in my head.
makes sense.
But the
Sometimes it
20%
takes a
can't be building and the 20% can't be parking.
The 20%.
The 20%.
Oh, yes, that's correct.
Okay.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. It can't be building. It could be parking if it's gravel. It can be
Okay.
parking if it's gravel.
Well, then okay. Well, we wanna try to discourage, I think we wanna encourage it in the back part of the house, or
The parking?
the parking,
Yes.
yes.
Okay, and now what were you saying, Seth? Can you say your point again now that I understand the math on the board? About the parking, about minimums and maximums or something about parking. Can you say it again?
Parking minimums?
I think you said something a minute ago which got me down the rabbit hole of the 80%. You said something about parking.
Yes, so if we're going to have tree cover to minimize the urban heat island effect, not just built environment adds to that, but parking as well. But the parking is going to be gravel. Gravel helps in terms of just rain, but not entirely of sunlight, correct?
Sunlight meaning, there's nothing
It's like-
growing.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it certainly
It's
can
like
infiltrate.
infiltrates, but it radiates back heat though.
Oh, sure, yeah,
Yes.
yes, I would say.
So rain wise, yes, you kind of mitigate that, but in terms of just the actual heat, you've done the same as just regular parking. And so if you are,
If it's gravel parking, I'm kind of thinking that it shouldn't be counted. If,
That the 20%
yeah,
plus parking
because it's still
plus
gonna,
building.
it's gonna contribute to the heat island even if it's gravel.
yeah, so it's still, you haven't really solved the issue, you're
Yeah.
adding to the problem that you're
Yeah.
trying to solve.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes,
So I'm sort of thinking that it ought to be excluded from the the parking should be included in the 80%. Cause it's
Parking
not,
should
right?
not be, right? Oh, yeah, it should be
It should
in
be
the lot
included in the
coverage,
80%
yeah,
coverage.
I see what you're saying.
So I'm thinking that the parking should be included in the 80% lot coverage. Because then the 20% is in fact green space and not parking with gravel.
we're gonna count gravel as green space.
No, I don't
No,
want,
she's
I
saying the
don't want
exact
to.
opposite of what you're
I
saying.
don't want to count the gravel as green space. Because I feel like it doesn't fully mitigate the urban heat island effect. So I'd rather count the gravel as parking included in the 80%. Rather than have to carve it out of the 20%.
Fair enough.
Does that make sense?
I'm slow to understand, but
Okay.
I
That's okay.
I think you guys are kind of saying the
Yeah,
same
I
point.
think we're saying the same
What you're saying is that if our goal is to reduce the heat island effect.
Yeah.
And we think that by putting gravel down, that's gonna happen, that's not gonna work. So if we really wanna reduce gravel and or asphalt as a heat island effect, we need to maintain that 20% as totally green plantable space. So that means that 20% that could have been gravel parking needs to now come into the 80% of the building and leave this 20% totally pristine green landscaping. You two are saying the same
We
thing.
are saying the same thing.
I agree, what you're saying makes sense, however, bigger picture, I wouldn't agree with that because then that goes against what I have always been advocating for in prioritizing building space to shelter people. So just
No,
in
that
principle,
too, I get that, but I think what you're saying is that the gravel doesn't reduce the heat island effect. So if the goal of
Yeah.
what Kathy is saying is to reduce heat island,
Mhm.
I think what you're saying is gravel isn't much better than asphalt. Isn't that what you're saying? Gravel's not much better than asphalt.
gravel is slightly better than asphalt.
Yeah, but not much. So
But I would
and then
need
we
it,
are
not,
then
I'm
a
not a
fur-
scientist though.
And then a further point would be the argument about what do we wanna use this 80% for? That's a second, not a secondary argument, but a follow-on argument of that.
Yeah, and it seems to me that if I'm a builder, of course I'm not, so I don't know if I'm saying this correctly, that if I have 80% that I can cover that property with building or parking, I'm probably gonna max it out on building with little parking. So maybe that follows your concept of reducing the incentive for parking.
Yes. That is a summary of what I think Seth has
Yeah.
been saying and what you're saying, all wrapped up in one.
Because it kind of reduces the incentive for the builder to build parking. They can make more money on the building than on the parking.
Seth, Seth would probably say is the developer could put more houses, which
Yeah.
would be more important, not so much from the profit
Yeah.
margin, but from the
Fewer,
people,
fewer parking spaces,
allows for more building units.
more building units, yeah.
Right?
I'm not following, to be honest.
Okay, that's okay.
But where would
It's
these,
okay.
where, yeah, we encourage the 80% as building, instead of having the 80% as includes both parking and building, and 20% is open. That's what I think we should encourage.
Yeah.
But there still has to be enough for the parking for the people who are in the building.
Right.
And the question is, in those kind of units, or that area, what do we suggest for the amount of parking there? Should we do the same thing, 1.5, or, because some of these units are multi-bedroom and that kind of stuff, and
Right.
working people, and they're gonna each need a car to go somewhere to work. So,
Yeah, go ahead, Ken.
Jim, you can park underneath the building, right? In other words, you could, have.
You can, now that's gonna be, no one has yet dug underground parking, though it's slightly,
Kind of in a hill.
kinda, sorta.
Which is, Cape Cod
The
5.
dockside is kinda sorta also doing
yeah,
that,
What's to say the
but you can, podium parking is what we're seeing, cause it's
Okay.
cost effective to do the podium parking. Now, that's a story though, so if you're talking about reducing the heights, you're limiting the ability for someone to construct if we're talking 3 stories and they have to put the parking under the building because 20% of that property has.
Like architecture wise?
So literally the first floor, the ground floor is the parking.
Okay, yeah, okay.
Yeah, they build above.
My major issue with this is really, I cannot envision what this is gonna look like. I mean, I can't get a sense of this having any rational relationship. One guy does this, one guy does that. I just can't see it coming together as a design unit in any way. And, I've driven around in particularly the areas I was pointing out that, small lots, medium-sized lots, the standards are all basically the same, but I'm trying to figure out if I take a picture 25 years from now, what I've got. And it just doesn't make any sense to me, I'm sorry.
Well, I think that's how the people next to the people at the Independence House feel with a 4-story building going right up next to, a women's shelter.
Mhm.
To your
One story,
point,
right? One story.
That's
one story,
yeah.
single, basically like a single family home. And now next to it's gonna be a 4-story apartment building. To your point, that is potentially the downside of what this zoning.
Well, my sense is what you're gonna get, maybe 30% of the properties redeveloped in a 10 or 15-year period. And it's just an awkward kind of place to be to me. And I don't know how you solve it. I wish I could give you a good idea, but there has to be a solution. I just don't know what the hell it is. It just is very confusing me. And I think probably what's gonna happen is you're gonna get situations like that which are gonna tailor what the next steps are gonna be. Because, you know, the people will be upset, they will not know quite what's gonna happen, and, you know, there'll be another meeting like this, and somebody will have better ideas than I certainly have at the moment.
I think that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to learn from the experience of the developments that are coming through under the existing zoning. And this 4-story building surrounded by residential, doesn't fit. So we're kind of in this position now where we can offer something different. And if that attracts development that we either like or dislike, that the town council decides they like or dislike, then they can reconvene the group and we can change it again.
Doesn't fit in what way?
Yeah. Pardon me?
Doesn't fit in what way?
Your work is never done.
Yeah.
Nope.
Yeah. So you have a 4-story apartment building that's built right up to the edge of the sidewalk, 4 stories, right?
That's maximal, that's if, that's it.
No,
That's
there's-
what's been
there is.
proposed, that's,
Okay.
There's going
that's,
to be a
that's.
building there.
It's
This is
actually
happening.
been submitted for approval, yeah. So that's the kind of development that's being attracted by what's described here.
Okay.
Right up to the edge of the property boundary, 4 stories straight up, no property boundary setback, next to a 1-story residential property. And
Yeah,
But can you go on with the negatives of that? You're setting a condition, I don't know what the effect or outcome of that would be.
I think that the people from the women's shelter are unhappy that they're gonna have a lot of density, literally right up to the lot line, looking into, from their 4-story building, looking into women's shelter. That's been basically a residential,
Use.
house next to a church. It is now gonna be a 4-story, high-density development.
But do we know that? Do we have,
Yes.
do we have blueprints, do we have renders?
Yes.
Do we have-
yes,
It's,
yes,
Yeah.
Do we have any testimonies from the women's shelter themselves?
yes.
Yes.
Then why am I just learning about this right now?
It's difficult to keep track of
there's
all
a
this
lot, there's a
development.
lot of stuff happening.
big area.
Yeah, it's-
So what I'm proposing is something in between. So if you have a residential neighborhood like this one in light purple, I don't think the 4-story apartment building right up to the edge of the property boundary is the answer. It's not something that seems like an attractive option for that area. In my opinion, we need something in between. As the properties redevelop, we should have something in between to allow for increased density and more housing in a way that doesn't detract from the residential flavor, if you will, of the community.
the single-family house, is that also zoned to do the same thing? Could they tear that
Sure
house
they
down
could.
and
Sure they
put up
could.
a 4-story building?
Sure they could, absolutely,
Which is basically, so it's in the same zone as this.
absolutely correct,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, it's right across the street from the HYCC,
Yeah, absolutely
Big
could, no
skating rink.
question about it, yeah.
and the fire station's right next door. So it's kind of a small house in an area that has these
Yeah.
large buildings that are
Yeah,
going
so
in.
I understand, if there's a sense that's where everything is going, maybe that's the answer to this, but it's just gonna be an awkward transition, and that's what you're facing right now. And particularly if you get to podium parking on one property and next door it's got a facade and, you're gonna need your urban design guidelines to really work for
Right.
you.
Right,
Um,
and all properties certainly aren't gonna redevelop at the same time.
No,
And they're all gonna look a little different, and that's sort of what brings the flavor to the community on that street, right? That's
if
gonna,
you call it a flavor,
well, I
Yeah.
mean,
I
Yeah.
don't,
I think you kind of summed it up. I think what we're looking for is the compromise
Something
that,
in between.
yeah, something in between, so.
I think we can go, if it's 3.5 to 4 on Main Street, or 3.5 on Main Street, we can go 3 here with no upper story.
With
And with
setbacks.
setbacks on, well, I don't know about the sides, but definitely the front. And the back, I'm not sure either, so, but I
That
think we
sounds
have
to
a
me like
setback.
a reasonable compromise.
Yeah, and they can
so.
still have a square brick apartment building or whatever in that area. Not that it fits in that area, but,
Yeah.
but they could do something with a little architectural flavor and it won't look like that. It'd be more of a transition area and I think that would probably be good.
How
I'm
does,
still confused on the correlation between a four-story building being set next to a women's shelter and why that would be an issue.
For you, it might not be, and for others, it might be. I think we should just leave it at that. Your experience, Seth, is totally your experience. And my experience is totally my experience. They may never, ever be the same. I think we just need to honor where people are at. And that means some people are unhappy and some people will be happy with the density. Like, it might be 50-50, it might be 70-30. It's just that's the word we got from the people that are in the women's shelter. They're not happy about it. I can't speak for them except for that's the feeling that's they've come forward. Whatever their reasons are, I can't I'm not them. But I just think they're not okay with it. And you may be, and that's okay too.
And they spoke to you directly.
they provided
It
public
was
comment.
public
It
testimony.
was public comment
Okay.
at the,
I guess, I mean,
Cynthia, could I get that public comment? Because I just.
Sure. I'll get them for you, yeah, I'll find out who has them, Seth, and I'll forward them to you. Absolutely.
I think there's
Thank
been a
you.
lot in the,
Yeah.
in the news media, but not a lot, because we don't get a lot of anything here, but it's been brought up a number of times in the local paper.
yeah, and I think this is certainly got some specific unique characteristics, but I mean, I guess I just look at it, Seth, if you live in a one-story home and you have a lot and next door, someone builds a four-story house, maybe you'd have no problem with that?
I wouldn't, because I've lived in that situation before.
Okay.
My
well,
sisters as well.
Yeah, I think a lot of people do. I know I would be pretty unhappy. I lived here 30 years and someone says they're gonna change the zoning and now you can build a four-story building right next to you, right up the lot line. I wouldn't be happy. So, as Kristen said, I think we may all have our own opinions and things,
Jim,
in this
when
particular.
the consultants who helped you put a lot of this together, was there this kind of discussion about how the transition might take place or what the ultimate design might look like or?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of design, it's more block, the design guidelines came after I really tackled that part of it. But in terms of transition, it's much like what you're saying, it's gonna take time, but there is a lot of, at least it was understood at least, that there's a lot of pent up interest in investment in Hyannis, and at least the narrative was that the current zoning at the time wouldn't allow for that investment.
Are most of these, is there a sort of percentage of this that is owner occupied or absentee owners, or do you have a sense of
That's being redeveloped?
the properties that would be redeveloped, yeah?
Currently, the properties that are gone through the permitting process are either boarded up vacant structures, underutilized. So I showed examples of like a structure that was a small retail site and they're adding some above units. And then there's things like on Barnstable Road that's it's very 70s oriented architecture and offices that are converting over. So it's stuff like that.
I think we'll talk about this more next week, but we got a little bit more thoughts on the table here.
I just have one sort of technical
Yeah.
question. How does the ADU implementation affect the lot coverage?
It would be included as a structure, so it would be part of that. So it wouldn't be impervious.
So if I'm the owner of one of those houses, right, and I have 80% lot coverage, and now I can add an ADU in the back, which is another structure that reduces my lot coverage is now greater, right? It could be, I don't know, I'm just making this up.
I guess you can't though if you don't have the availability.
Yeah.
Right,
don't have
so that, in that instance, it wouldn't be allowed.
Yep.
Right,
Okay.
you've gotta have the
Okay.
space to be able to build
Okay,
it. Yeah.
okay,
Still has to adhere to zoning.
okay.
With that, Jim, I wanna let you get to the solar presentation. We'll do that, then we'll pick up this conversation next week a little bit
That's
more
a
too.
really interesting conversation, yeah. Okay.
And as you get started with this, Jim, just as quick background, so the state has specific guidelines that, you know, we have to live under.
You're gonna spoil my presentation?
Okay, all right, then I'll let you. Okay.
So if we don't have
Take away
copies
his
of these
thunder.
already, so this,
I'll just pass
yeah,
it.
that'd be
Just
great.
give it to me while you can do your thing. You take one.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
okay.
So, solar. So ground mounted solar, switching gears completely. This is large ground mounted solar. So this isn't rooftop solar. This isn't, car canopy solar, anything like that. This is large ground mounted solar. There's a definition in the ordinance on what it is. I believe it's 250 kilowatt.
Sorry, okay.
So it's something like you see the picture down there. That's an example of large ground mounted solar. And you probably have seen these from time to time driving on the highways or near the transfer station. There's one, or a large one.
The college?
Yeah, the college has one. So they're growing rapidly. So we have a local ordinance, but it starts with the state law. And I believe Kate Conley's online, so she can please correct me if I say anything incorrect. But at the last meeting, we talked about Mass General Law 48, Section 3, the Dover Amendment. And we were talking about different uses that are exempt under 48.3. And I believe Attorney Conley indicated zoning is one of them. Not zoning, solar is one of them. And so, however, solar is treated slightly different in 48 Section 3. So if you pull up the full Mass General Law 48.3, there's very specific items that are exempt. And then solar was added over time, and now it says, no zoning ordinance or bylaw shall prohibit or unreasonably regulate the installation of solar energy storage systems or building of structures that facilitate collection of solar energy, except where necessary to protect the public health, safety, and welfare. So it gave us a little bit of an out that, hey, we can permit this, we can review this to protect the public health, safety, welfare. So how does that function in terms of permitting? A lot of towns, look at it through site plan review and sometimes there's special permit requirements. So we began to look at a number of those. While we were looking at amending our zoning, and so I should have started with that. So we looked to amend our zoning in, I believe it was 2022, 2023. And while we were doing that, we being the town and with the planning board as the sponsor, this court case came out. So this is, for land use law, this is kind of how land use law molds over time. Law comes out, someone institutes an ordinance, someone looks to develop, they don't like that ordinance or they don't agree with that ordinance and they say it doesn't meet the state law, so we're gonna go to land court to appeal it. And this is what occurred at Tracer Lane versus the city of Waltham. And ultimately what was occurring here was Waltham tried to limit a large ground-mounted solar in the neighboring community, but it was going through their town with a small driveway to access that large ground-mounted solar. And so they said, no, it's prohibited in this area, and we can't permit that driveway that goes through. The judge ultimately said that he disagreed, and that you're essentially creating a ban on large ground-mounted solar by doing that. There was a nuance there in his decision that said that the city of Waltham only allows for 2% of their town for large ground-mounted solar. He didn't expand upon that, so every town is left wondering what's an appropriate percentage. But we now know 2% is not it, and it needs to be more than that. And that you can't outright ban large ground-mounted solar, so you have to properly permit. We at the time only had large ground-mounted solar for essentially two areas around the transfer station and around in the kind of where the airport is, where you see all those large ground-mounted solars over near the airport. And it was site plan review, and that was it. Now, there was another site that was in litigation that was appealing based on the same argument that the town of Barnstable was prohibiting large ground mounted solar, and that location is 810 Wakeby, and I think we heard from a few folks a while back about their concerns about 810 Wakeby. And so it was through legal counsel, we suggested to the planning board that maybe 810 Wakeby should be considered, but it was ultimately up to the planning board and town council to decide whether or not to add 810 Wakeby. And when thinking about whether or not to add 810 Wakeby, maybe we need to enhance standards because the current standards were kind of minimal at the time. So when looking at the standards, we began to look at best practices, and I was the one that looked at these. We looked at best practices in many different states across the country, in Europe. Even there was some standards in Australia that we grabbed because they were so good that we brought them over, worked them through the process, and made them our own here in the town of Barnstable. And so ultimately what we added was a location and process. And process being special permit requirement if they're in the residential district, underlying zoning residential district. So these are the two areas that were allowed for existing large ground mounted solar. And then we added that one little guy. Over on the left side, so if you look, so on the left where it points where Sandwich and Mashpee and Barnstable come together, there's a new little hatch right there. That
Where is it? In the corner,
on
way
the,
in the
on
corner.
the left, you'll see a little hatch appear.
Didn't make it fluorescent yellow.
Yeah, I know. So that was added. That location was added. So in the map, and so these are the two areas that were allowed, and that is 810 Wakeby. It was a former, I think, junkyard. A lot of random stuff back there. I actually walked the site this morning to confirm everything is in compliance with the current permits, and so. Through that, we as the town added a location, and then we added a lot of standards that you'll see in this. The document I handed out is the total ordinance. I believe it's 10 pages long. It went from 2 to 10, I believe. Added a lot of definitions, including that there were originally as of right citing, and then we added except that a special permit is required when locating in a residential zoning district. That new site is a residential zoning district underlined. So this would require a special permit. It ultimately got a special permit. Then it added a number of different sections, prohibiting batteries, adding existing conditions features, so adding things like they had to provide survey topography of existing conditions, adding stormwater management standards. There wasn't any at the time. So things like you'll see in there any areas where there's transformers. That transformer has to be on a pad that has a drainage structure that can hold 110% of the liquid that is in that transformer. So any concerns about any impacts to groundwater was addressed in that. Things like operation and maintenance plans. So how are these going to be operated over time? Who's maintaining it over time? How is it being maintained over time? Approval from FAA. That seems to be a standard throughout the country because of potential reflection off of these hazard materials requirements, basically saying that you can't have hazardous materials in there, and significantly increase setbacks and enhancing screening requirements. So all applications in the residential districts must follow additional, so these were added for everything. Every solar site that comes forward has to do all of those, while if you're in a residential, you have to do those and then some. And so even more setback requirements, additional screening criteria. Sorry, the chairs are in the way.
It's okay, I just couldn't see.
And expanded operation and maintenance plan, which includes working with the fire chief in the area and the building inspector to confirm everything's in compliance. Again, we always had to return back to say that these requirements are necessary to protect the health, safety, and welfare. Because if you remember on that second slide, the state law says you can only regulate for the public health, safety, welfare. So everything that was in there, continually, we had to point back to the fact that we're doing this for the public health, safety, welfare. A special permit or a site plan criteria that was added. So these dimensional requirements. So I talked about enhanced setbacks. So on that, the first one actually talks about no PFAS. So that's obviously is a big thing here in town. And everywhere, but even more so, I think, here in town. And so we mandated that they provide us with certifications that there's no PFAS in any of the materials that are being put forward in the site. And actually, this site actually has already done that and gone through that process. Additionally, setback requirements. So we're talking about 250 kilowatts has to be at least. So the large ground mounted solar installation has to be at least 150 feet from a residential district. So that residential line, and then you draw 150 feet from there. And then 100 feet from all other property lines. And again, it states to contain noise. Probably if we were to change anything, it might be to add a little nuance to that, because in reality, solar panels aren't very noisy. Though if you add transformers over time, they can be quite noisy if you add them together. So that was the thought process there.
Jim, can you go back one
Yeah,
slide?
absolutely.
When you say 150-foot setback to residentially developed lots, got it, and 100-foot setback from all other property lines. So an example would be if the property line next to them is not developed?
Or developed for commercial or industrial, or is a conservation lot. Really anything that's not residential. The intent here is there are some residential homes nearby, and we wanted enhanced setbacks for those residential homes.
Yeah, I'm just wondering why we put 100-foot setback from all other property lines, because what if something is not developed yet, but it's a residential lot? Does it still count as residentially developed? Let's say somebody owns a vacant lot, it's a
Right.
half-acre lot that's built.
It wouldn't be, no.
It's 150 feet or 100.
That's right.
I'm asking.
If it's not residentially
No,
developed,
it's
it would be 100.
So if we have a blank empty lot,
Yes.
it could be 100 feet.
100 feet. Correct.
I'm just wondering why we didn't just make it 150 feet all the way around for all property.
The nuances of the site perhaps had some limitations there, but I think that would
Could
be
we amend that going forward?
potentially. I would say that any amendments to this likely would be for any future
Yeah, that's what I'm
property
saying,
that
yeah.
is added to the district.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's not that much anyway, really, when you get down to it.
A few examples of, again, added for special permit requirements. So that was site plan only. This is special permit, enhanced standards, where we talk about the definition of hazardous materials and making sure that, as I mentioned with the containment, 100%, 110% of the hazardous material volume contained within the associated equipment is caught and collected. And it's designed for the 100-year storm within a 24-hour period. So that's a stormwater containment standard that an engineer is going to have to go through and design for that containment. So we make sure that it's not getting into our groundwater, essentially. Same thing with the expanded operation and maintenance plan. One of the main key things here is that the town understands who is responsible for the site. I mean, a lot of times these large ground mounted solars, you build it, it creates energy, it creates money, and you kind of leave it alone. But, if anything were to happen, the town's gonna be the first to respond, so we needed to be able to understand who would be that contact. And actually, in the decision for 810 Wakeby, they included a condition, and it was agreed to by the applicant, that contact has to live on this side of the bridge. Simply because it's pretty hard to get here in the summertime if you don't, and if it's an emergency, you need to be nearby.
And as far as the expanded operation and maintenance plan, I know it's a proposed special permit criteria. Who is it who's reviewing the special permit? Is that planning, the planning board, the planning department?
Yep,
both?
so practically speaking, for the one that was permitted recently, it goes to my office, we review it in conjunction with the fire chief, the police chief, and the building commissioner.
Perfect, thank you.
And then commissioning plan, so it's required that the developer go through proper protocols with the fire chief and the building commissioner as to the uniform code, so meaning the fire code and the building code, and making sure that they understand how it fully operates.
Okay.
So yeah, that's
That's
in
it.
a nutshell, real quick review of the ground mounted solar overlay district. Certainly could have some tweaks, but I do think there was a lot of good time spent enhancing it, at least for the protection of the current situation.
Jim?
Yes, sir.
All right, we looked at the map first for the three areas and a little thing on the left. Those are the only ones that they can be put in at this point.
Well, so
Do we add to it with that little spur up there or not?
So the question is really back to this: is this enough? Large ground mounted solar.
Okay.
You know, from our opinion, maybe it's more than enough, but we won't know the answer to that unless someone were to challenge us, essentially, or challenge another town. And again, I think Attorney Conley might be on, who might be able to speak better to that. I don't know if she's still on, but nevertheless, so this is what we have today. This is what is permitted based on the criteria done, but certainly someone could potentially challenge, just putting it out there, someone potentially could challenge based on 48 section 3 of the state law.
Okay, so this is under the criteria of what the state requires at this point for the amount of available land to do so in our town?
Well, so we don't know what
We don't know what.
We know from Tracer that 2%'s not enough.
Exactly.
What does this represent now? Any sense for what we have?
Well, so it's how you calculate it. So we tried to make the argument, and we never had to fully form the argument, that if you add this, and then you take out all of our wetlands, all of our fully developed lots, how much is left to develop out is fairly minimal.
Which makes sense, yeah.
It would make sense to me, but nevertheless, we don't know if that is gonna make sense to a judge one day. So we haven't fully formed that argument because we haven't had to yet.
Just out of curiosity, what percentage does that represent of that, using that metric? What did you come
I
up
wanted
with?
to say we were close to the upper 60% of our property was, if you removed everything that can't be constructed and you just have these and what could be constructed left, it was somewhere in that area.
And we had to add that 810 Wakeby because we didn't have those two established already. Or we had the two established.
We had these two established already.
In our concern was if we didn't add Wakeby, that Wakeby might take us to court to challenge us to say they should be able to do, like, we already had a.
We were already in court. When I got here, that was already being kind of concluded. And that site was at court.
Okay, so even though we already had a ground-mounted solar photovoltaic overlay district, we had one already. Wakeby's contention was, we should be able to do this anyway.
And the argument
By
was this,
that.
48-3.
And so by adding what we added, we strengthened the concept of having areas where we allow it and also protecting the public's welfare.
Right, I think that was the argument, yes.
Okay. So we're sort of in this position now where it's wait and see, and
Every community really is.
yeah, and we're looking at the document that you prepared, which I have to say is really good. Should we look at this to decide if there are things that we can do to enhance it, perhaps, so that if something does come down the road that requires us to respond and allow them to build it, that this is as strong as it could be? Is that the position that we're in?
You mentioned there were a couple of tweaks, I mean.
Yeah, absolutely, I think
suggest
there
what
certainly
those would
could be
be?
some
Yeah.
tweaks to enhance it, absolutely.
I have some questions, if you don't mind. In looking at the materials that you presented, so you talked about that, what I didn't see is a decommissioning plan.
It's in there, it's in that order, I didn't highlight it
Okay,
here.
so you have one, okay.
Yeah, it's a requirement,
Well, I
decommissioning
only
plan
got
with
to
a bond.
I only got to the second page.
Yeah, no problem.
Sorry about that.
It's a
Yeah,
lengthy
I
ordinance.
understand. I'll look at
for
that,
certain.
okay. So that's certainly important, because you wanna make sure that if, they walk away from it, that they don't leave you with an inoperable, unrecyclable, destroyed piece of land, essentially.
And we
Yeah.
assured that, in that, just based on my past experience, that scrap metal isn't a part of the reduction of bond, because we're not in the scrap metal game.
Right.
You know, some people could be, but we are not.
So when you talked about the stormwater aspect of it, I was happy to see the 100-year storm event is in there, because that's sort of the standard that we use for everything. But I didn't notice any contingency for climate impacts. So I know, in my experience working with the staff, that they include that in the calculations for stormwater. There's a factor, it's not necessarily just the 100-year storm event, there's a little factor that they build in, so maybe it's 120%, I'm just making that up, I don't really know what it is. But it's not specifically stated in here that you're gonna include.
110% in here, but you're right.
It's not specifically stated. So if it's not specifically stated in the ordinance, and as I've said before, I want you to work here forever. But if you leave someday, that 110% is just gone out the window, and then whoever follows you would sort of make up their own way of handling it, and it's not codified. So I would just make a suggestion that that's perhaps one area that you could include reference to, including, a factor to increase, a factor to take into consideration the impacts of increased precipitation events, so that it's 110% of the 100-year storm event, okay? So that would be one. And then what also is not really in here, which I think is really important, and it is happening really all around the world, is how do you manage the land underneath the panels? So the picture that you showed at the beginning is a great example of land that is not well managed underneath the panels. Right at the beginning. Yeah, right at the beginning. You have a lot of area of land where there's no vegetation. So what that means is greater stormwater runoff and erosion of the land. So one of the big activities that's going on in land use with respect to this sort of thing is the planting of native vegetation and managing it for native low-growing vegetation underneath the solar panels. It's not in your.
We got it in there.
I think it is right there.
Sorry, I didn't highlight all the changes, because again, it's 10 ordinance, or 10 pages, but yeah, that's one of the things that was highly talked about during the public hearing. Making sure that not only for stabilization and minimal maintenance, but just.
It reduces the maintenance costs, because when you have a mess like this and it rains, you got all the splashing of the mud onto the panels, and they become a little less effective.
Exactly.
So I know there was also mention of this buffer area around, right? I forgot what I was gonna say, I'm really sorry. Totally.
Having a good buffer area.
Totally vacant.
Making it good for noise, screening for the residents who live next to it.
Yeah, I think that's certainly important, and making sure that the vegetation that's planted around it, of course, is not just one species, that there's a good, resilient landscape. So some of I have to look closer at the language, and I'll do that, and I'll come back to you if there's any sort of improvements that I can suggest with respect to landscaping, because it's not just about native vegetation, which is great, because that means it's sustainable, but it has to be resilient, which means you need good biodiversity. Otherwise, one insect going in there, it's just gonna wipe everything out. Then you're gonna end up with this. Right, we certainly don't want that.
Jim says it sounds like you've got some thoughts as to what
You've done some
could be
great-
some
great
tweaks
work.
and stuff.
Yeah.
So for our meeting on the 14th, could we ask you to maybe give some thought to some suggestions we might want to look at here? And then some discussions, I think you may have some thoughts as well as some of the short-term rental. And then I'd like to talk a little bit about the by right zoning. Following through the LCP process, it's the sentiment of the community has been, not to expand the by right zoning throughout the town. Is that a correct statement, based on what?
And by right zoning meaning like what The downtown Hyannis zoning?
No, beyond that, people, the feedback has been to maintain the zoning, the single-family zoning that we have outside that.
Yes,
Is that correct?
that's
Okay. So I think one of the things, I wanna talk a little about, if you have some thoughts on that, some information, maybe some feedback, what you've seen from the LCP, so we can talk about some of those areas as well. I mean, we obviously have it in certain areas, for development, downtown, and some commercial areas, but maybe talk a little bit about that as well.
Is that everywhere, do you know?
What's that?
Concerns expressed about maintaining residential zoning, is that everywhere?
Within some of the districts, how would you describe it, Jim?
Is it everywhere?
I would say, based on the feedback, the Resource Protection Overlay District is kind of, my takeaway from it. So the town is about 70% the Resource Protection Overlay District, which allows for 2 acres, single-family zoning. And I think that's wants to be, from what we've heard, is a lot of protection for that. And maybe it goes beyond that, but outside of that area, I mean, the Independence Park, I think, is being discussed as what the future of that may hold. There's an area kind of around the high school that concerns about maybe workforce housing, so that's maybe an area. But other than that, I think it's mostly the growth incentive zone and the Resource Protection Overlay District kind of play well with each other, and that's kind of been our growth pattern over time. So the growth incentive zone, look for fostering redevelopment, which is much basically what we've been having these discussions. And the Resource Protection Overlay District is the balance, so that's really the by right single family zoning.
And the thought is to create some of the historic village centers, so you've got, Centerville, you've got Osterville, I can't remember how many you have on the map there,
Pretty much all
Jim.
of them. Yeah. And try looking at ways to enhance the historic preservation of that. We actually already started talking about some grant opportunities to potentially do that.
Okay, so maybe we talk about some of those areas there.
Okay, great.
So what my thought is, I am gonna work to put together a topical outline that I will distribute through Cynthia to everybody before our meeting on the 21st. Talking about the key issues that we've talked about, I think through this process, I wanna make sure that everybody's kind of on the same page if we missed anything. And then between the 21st and our meeting on the 14th, gonna work to put together kind of a draft memo incorporating the two that Jim has put together for us on the regulatory agreements and some of the very specific zoning aspects that we can then, review on the 14th, get feedback, and then we'll have a final meeting on the 28th to kind of discuss and finalize the memo. I don't know if I have to have the memo to the town council on the 28th, I guess we expire on the 31st. If we have a week's time to kind of refine that and stuff, but that's kind of what I'm thinking. So the 21st will be a working group meeting without Jim. The 14th, we'll be reviewing the memo, draft memo, and then the 28th, hopefully finalizing our recommendations. And then on the 21st, we'll have those presentations, talk about the SDRs and by right.
14th.
Yeah, and any thoughts you might have on the solar. Anything else, people, that I missed or thoughts people have on that? No? Kathy, I had an item there, follow up on your presentation. I'll say if anybody has any thoughts, maybe just to speak to Kathy directly on that. Okay. So then our next meeting will be the 21st. I believe it's 3 p.m. Is that what we had?
Yes.
I think so.
Is it
And that, do we know if that will be in the it's the
Selectmen's
selectmen's
conference
be
room.
here, okay. And then if everybody, we're looking at the 14th and the 28th for March, so if we can get those on the calendar now.
We got times.
We're gonna do 3:30
On the 14th and the 28th
on the 14th and the
of March.
28th.
Okay.
And we'll have to confirm with Sarah, but hopefully we can get this room for both of those
Okay.
meetings. And then, I don't know if people have had a chance by now to take a look at the minutes for December, let's see, what did we have? December 13th and January 17th. If so, do we have a motion to approve?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
And I think with that, just need a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Second, all in favor?
Aye.
Great, thank you. Thank you.